Hello everyone and welcome back to Towergate. It is Saturday, Towergate Day 255, November the 18th, 2017. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I also want to say hello to my new subscribers and welcome you to our community here. We are in pursuit of the truth. That's what we do here, every day on Towergate. Okay, let's get started. We have a lot of things to cover and not much time to do it. So the very most important, probably breaking story that we have today: in the last 24 hours, we have learned the name of the confidential FBI informant who was undercover for 4 years working for the FBI in the Uranium One scandal. Of course, we know that this individual has recently been given permission to speak to the Congress and present to them his story, as well as all the evidence that he has to back up his story. And we expect that that interview with the Congress, those hearings will be held sometimes before the end of this year. So this man is named William Campbell, and he gave this interview to Reuters, in which case he allowed Reuters to use his name. So we now know who this confidential Russian informant was, who was undercover in the Uranium One investigation for the FBI. William Campbell is his name, and he was a lobbyist who was working for, that was his front or his cover. He actually was a lobbyist, but he was also working for the FBI because he was on the inside. So he was a lobbyist working for this Russian nuclear energy company, and that was his professional position. But of course, he was working actually for the FBI and providing them with information as an undercover informant. So this is what we've learned, that he has a tremendous amount of evidence, and according to the Reuters story, Mr. Campbell has and will present to the Congress in these hearings recorded phone calls of Russian officials discussing donating to Bill Clinton and the Clinton Foundation money to get the deal done to deliver 20% of America's uranium to this Russian government-owned nuclear energy company, Uranium One. Now, the thing that's important here is there's a couple important things. Number one, at the time when this all went down, Bob Mueller, that's right, Uncle Bob Mueller, was the FBI director and was certainly in the loop and knew about every bit of it and knows about all this evidence. And there was a time during this investigation where the Department of Justice attorneys who were following this case and keeping up with the notes they were getting and the information they were getting from Mr. Campbell, they actually went to the DOJ to get a wiretap on officials at the Clinton Foundation. This is new information. But the Obama administration, we would assume at this point that would be Loretta Lynch, shot that request down. So here we have this William Campbell, who's a lobbyist for this Russian nuclear energy firm, but working undercover for the FBI as an informant, recording these phone conversations of Russians talking about how they could pull this off by using the Clinton Foundation and Bill Clinton to bribe them to get the deal done. He's got all these recordings, which he's going to share with the Congress. But more importantly, we're learning that at some point during the investigation, as he was giving his information throughout this investigation to the Department of Justice and the FBI, and they were looking at it, at some point they determined that they should get a wiretap or surveillance on the Clinton Foundation officials who might be involved in this. And we can assume that would include Hillary, Bill, and Chelsea. But that was rejected by the Department of Justice. Specifically, we can assume that would be Loretta Lynch. She was the Attorney General. So these are just a few of the tidbits that we have gotten from this Reuters interview with Mr. Campbell. If this all turns out to be true, if he has this information, if he does have these tapes, and we do learn that it is true that the Obama administration shot down the request for the surveillance on the Clinton Foundation, there's going to be, that is a major, that's major obstruction. And we are going way above the Rotten Reverend Clinton on this one. This will go directly to the heads of the Department of Justice, which would be Loretta Lynch, and of course, Obama himself. Now, Obama himself, he has managed to stay kind of out in the peripheral on all of these things that we've been talking about. But this would bring him and drag him directly into the inner circle of this scheme. This would bring Obama directly into the scheme. So, we'll continue to follow this story. I don't know how much of this interview with Reuters has actually been released. There's just snippets here and there that we're getting, but we can assume there might be a wider story which they may or may not publish. But just from the tidbits of information that we're getting, we can see where this is going. And this will do in the Clintons and the Clinton Foundation. This will certainly ruin the Clinton Foundation. And this will certainly implicate not just Bill and Hillary Clinton, Chelsea Clinton, but all the heads of the Clinton Foundation, of which there were several over this time period. But this also drags in the Department of Justice, the FBI, and Obama himself into this obstruction of an attempt at digging into this investigation. So this is important information, and we'll continue to follow it to see what more we learn. But just this alone, if this all comes out, if Mr. Campbell has these tapes, if he has this evidence of what we just talked about, it's curtains for the Clintons, Obama, Lynch, and probably many others. There's dozens of people who would be implicated as a result of this information alone. And we expect that there'll be much, much more. So we'll keep following that. Next, Senator Magoo. Senator John Magoo. That's right. The official John Magoo theme music. John Magoo, you got some explaining to do, Willis. I've been looking at a lot of the excerpts from this book that's going to be coming out by Luke Harding. Luke Harding is, of course, the journalist who worked for The Guardian, who all through this process of the dossier being put together and all that was going on with the dossier, Mr. Harding was in contact and was a major outlet for Glenn Simpson, Christopher Steele, and others involved in the dossier. He was intimately involved in receiving information as this dossier story was playing itself out, and even before it was released to the public by BuzzFeed back in the summer. In mid to late June, he began having correspondence, Luke Harding began having correspondence with Glenn Simpson and Christopher Steele, as he was getting bits and pieces of some of the things that would appear in the dossier, known at that time as simply as memos. It was all these memos, which I think there were 35 or some odd memos, which eventually became the entire dossier. So these memos, as this dossier was being put together, was being sent to Luke Harding, the journalist over there at The Guardian. Now, he has written a book, and his book is based on a series of interviews that he did with Christopher Steele. Now, his book, the attempt that he's making in his book is to prove that Christopher Steele is legitimate and that his sources are legitimate and that the story is legitimate. All of it. This is what he's selling in the book. But when you look at just some of the excerpts, and the book isn't out yet, but some of the excerpts are making their way into the media. So just when I look at just some of the excerpts here, unless you just take fully upon faith of what Christopher Steele is saying, you wipe all that away and you just look at some of the things we're learning that Luke Harding is revealing. It looks to me to be more damaging to the dossier, the FBI, the U.S. government, whatever agencies were involved, the Department of Justice, Obama, the Clinton campaign, the DNC, Christopher Steele at Fusion GPS. It appears to me that it's just as damaging to them as it is to Trump and his team and the narrative. That's what I get out of it just from looking at this. You would have to accept the narrative at face value to accept what is in the book and what he's trying to do in the book, which is prove that the dossier is true. But let's look at some of the things that we're learning from these disclosures by Luke Harding that will be in his book that directly go to John McCain. In Harding's book, he claims that McCain was given the full dossier directly by Fusion's Glenn Simpson. Now, this is a tricky word, directly. That could mean one of two things. That could mean that Glenn Simpson actually went to John McCain personally, walked in his office and said, here you go. Now, that is not my understanding at this point based on what we've learned in the civil suit in the UK, which is Mr. Gubarev versus Christopher Steele. There, we have learned from the court filings that, according to Christopher Steele, it was done digitally. He sent the dossier, the 35-page dossier, in a digital format to Glenn Simpson at Fusion GPS, and then advised him to forward a digital copy of the dossier to John McCain and or his right-hand man, David Creamer. That is what we've learned from the UK deposition. But the way that Harding describes it in his book, he says that McCain was given the full dossier directly. Well, that's a tricky word again. When he says directly, it gives the impression that it was a personal thing where Simpson walked into McCain's office or met him in a coffee shop or something like that. That is not what we understand to be the case from the depositions in the UK court filings. It appears that that was done through a digital medium, not personally. But that needs to be aired out. So that brings a couple questions to light. Number one, what is McCain's relationship with Glenn Simpson? Did John McCain know Glenn Simpson prior to this deal with the dossier? What is the extent of his involvement and relationship with Glenn Simpson? Senator Magoo needs to answer that question. It's very important. Because when you look at this trio, these three musketeers of hardcore anti-Trumpers, you have Senator Magoo, Christopher Steele, and Glenn Simpson. These three individuals were key in the creation of the dossier, the dissemination of the dossier, and more importantly, how the dossier found its way into the FBI and into their purview. And there's various routes that took, and we'll be covering those in this video as we move forward. So these are important things, and the reason why it's important is because we also learned in the deposition from the case in the UK of Mr. Gubarev versus Christopher Steele that Christopher Steele's attorney, in defending his client, because the accusation is that possibly Christopher Steele leaked the dossier to BuzzFeed, which is the point of the lawsuit. But according to Christopher Steele's attorneys in their deposition filing in that lawsuit, they're stating that that is not the case, that Christopher Steele did not approve or want that dossier leaked to the public. It was meant only to be given to intelligence, the intelligence community or the FBI, despite the fact that he contradicts that very statement by the efforts he made in meeting with media people to try to promote the dossier and get it into the public domain. So he kind of contradicts himself there. But what we learned that was most important was that the attorneys for Christopher Steele are stating that there was only a small handful, their words, small handful of individuals who had access to the full 35-page dossier. That would have been Mr. Steele himself and his partner at Orbis, their company in the UK. There would have been Mr. Creamer and John McCain, Mr. Creamer being John McCain's right-hand man, and Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS. And then, while it's not disclosed, that's what's disclosed in the deposition coming from Christopher Steele's lawyers. But one other entity that is not mentioned that should be considered is the fact that the client probably had a copy. And who was the client? Well, the client was the rotten Reverend Clinton. And it was her attorney, her general counsel for the Clinton campaign, Mark Elias, who was the middleman handling that. So we can assume that that dossier might have gone to Mr. Elias and then on to the rotten Reverend Clinton. We can also assume that Mr. Podesta, John Podesta, was in possession or had knowledge of that dossier because he was the rotten Reverend's chief campaign chair of her campaign, as well as the fact that his personal attorney was also Mr. Elias. So that brings a few extra players into the picture that are not discussed or are not mentioned in the lawsuit. But keep in mind, when that deposition took place and the lawyers made this statement of who would have had access to the dossier, at that time we did not know that the end client was the rotten Reverend. The middleman was Mr. Elias, and that was not known at the time that the deposition happened, or certainly if it was known to Christopher Steele, he did not disclose that to his attorneys. And we don't know the answer to that question yet. We'll obviously be getting the answer to that question, though, for sure. But the big problem that Senator Magoo has got on this particular issue and why he should be investigated and is in fact, just from what we know, guilty of a crime is because we now know from what we've learned in recent weeks that Fusion GPS, at the same time that they were putting together this dossier for their client, the rotten Reverend Clinton, at that same exact time they were also operating as an undeclared agent for the Russians, the Russian government, and pushing the Magnitsky Act. So on one hand, you had Fusion GPS working for the rotten Reverend Clinton, putting together the dirty dossier to destroy the candidacy of Donald Trump. At the very same time, Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson, was working for the Russian government to try to roll back and repeal the Magnitsky Act. And that was where Natalia Veselnitskaya came into play. She was hired by Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson, to be the attorney who would be able to get a meeting with Trump Jr., Manafort, and Kushner so that she could persuade them or lobby them to inform the president about the Magnitsky Act and see if they could get him to repeal the Magnitsky Act. So here we have Fusion GPS working both sides of the coin, working two different things at the same time, but they were operating as an undeclared agent for the Russian government at the time. So that means that John McCain, Senator Magoo, was coordinating with Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS, who was at that time operating illegally as an undeclared agent for the Russian government. Now, whether he was aware of that or not, I don't know, but it certainly would be logical for him to conclude that. He certainly knew about the Magnitsky Act. He was sitting there on the panel in the hearings when Mr. Browder gave his testimony and told his story. Senator Magoo certainly had to know that Fusion GPS was also operating, working for the Russian government as an undeclared foreign agent at the same time that Magoo was working with him to promote and help spread the dossier. This puts Senator Magoo into criminal conflict. He needs to be called in front of the House Intel Committee. He needs to be investigated because this is a criminal act. He can only plead ignorance, but I don't think it's going to fly. Not in his position. So that's that issue. Let's move on. We can see that Christopher Steele, BuzzFeed, and Fusion GPS are all lining up and standing behind the story. They're all saying, in their legal defense, is that they stand behind the dossier. Steele is saying that 70 to 90% of it's true. BuzzFeed stands behind the story. And, of course, Glenn Simpson stands behind the story. Now, why is this when they can't prove it? Well, it's possibly one of two things. It's a legal maneuver. Number one, what they're trying to do is delay the court proceedings. Because what they're saying is, hey, we believe that the dossier is true, and right now there's an investigation in the United States by a special prosecutor, Uncle Bob Mueller, who's investigating this. And once his investigation is complete, we think we'll be vindicated. But we cannot have these court hearings go forward on this issue because the investigation has not been completed. So, on one hand, they want this to drag out and use it as a delay tactic. The other part of that would be that when it comes time to assess the amount of damages that BuzzFeed will certainly have to pay Mr. Gubarev, and when it comes time for possibly Christopher Steele to have to pay some damages, and possibly others, they will be able to use this to reduce the amount of money that would have to be paid, because it would throw another element into this where the judge can say, well, yeah, you believe the story was true. As it turns out, it was not true, but boy, there sure was a lot of evidence, and we could see why you would believe this. So we can kind of give you a break. So instead of paying Mr. Gubarev $100 million, you only have to pay him $10 million. So it's a delay tactic, and it is also to set up Mr. Steele's attorneys and BuzzFeed's attorneys for the end of the trial when they're actually assessing the damages that must be paid, and they can use this to say, yeah, they're guilty, but man, anybody could have fallen for this because it sure looked good. So we can go kind of light on them. We're not going to hit them for $100 million. Let's just, yeah, they got to pay some penalty because they did defame Mr. Gubarev, but we can see how that might have happened. So it's one of two things or both. It's a legal tactic for delay and also a legal tactic to try and reduce the amount of damages that will be assessed to the client of the attorney representing BuzzFeed and Christopher Steele. And there could be others involved. Some of their names might be the Rotten Reverend Clinton, because we know she now paid for it. Mr. Elias might be liable as well. He's the one that set it up. Now, it's very, very simple in this particular case for Mr. Gubarev. His attorneys, ultimately, BuzzFeed released the dossier on January the 10th of 2017. And in that dossier, for those of you who are new to my channel and haven't been keeping up, essentially, Mr. Gubarev, Alexei Gubarev, owns Webzilla. He is a Russian businessman who owns this Russian tech firm. They provide web hosting services on the net. Mr. Gubarev owns that company. In the dossier, the 35-page dossier that was released by BuzzFeed, the dossier claimed that Mr. Gubarev, his company, Webzilla, his technicians there are the ones that orchestrated the breach, the hack, to the DNC servers. Mr. Gubarev vehemently denies this and says that by his name being put into that article in the dossier, by his name being mentioned in the dossier, he was defamed, and therefore he launched the defamation lawsuit against Christopher Steele in the UK as being the source, and against BuzzFeed in Florida for being the ones who published it. So it's a defamation lawsuit. And Mr. Gubarev's attorneys don't need to prove that BuzzFeed are the ones who released the dossier on January 10th, 2017. That's a known fact. There's no question that BuzzFeed defamed the character of Mr. Gubarev, unless they can prove that it's true. What BuzzFeed has to prove is they have to prove that Mr. Gubarev, his company, was the company that hacked the DNC. He cannot prove that. He cannot prove that. So BuzzFeed is going to pay Mr. Gubarev. The question is how much. Christopher Steele was the source. So yes, he'll probably have to pay damage as well to Mr. Gubarev, because he was the source for the charges in the dossier that led to the defamation of Mr. Gubarev. So Christopher Steele and possibly and BuzzFeed for sure are going to be paying Mr. Gubarev unless they can prove that Mr. Gubarev is lying and that his tech firm Webzilla did, or technicians working there did, hack the DNC, that they were the source of the breach at the DNC. And they're not going to be able to prove that. The only way they could is to get a hold of them servers. But do you hear anybody asking to look at those servers? I'm not aware of anybody asking to look at them servers but me and a bunch of YouTubers. I don't hear any members of Congress talking about it. I don't hear about Mr. Mueller wanting to do it. We know Comey wasn't allowed to do it. We know the DHS were not permitted to do it by the DNC. I have seen nothing where Mr. Gubarev's attorneys on either the UK suit or the Florida BuzzFeed suit have requested that. And that's the only way they would find out, is to look at those servers and determine who actually did breach the server. And it's unlikely that BuzzFeed will subpoena those servers in their defense. Because if they thought that they could, that's exactly how they would prove their innocence. But they haven't made that move. What does that tell us? It tells us that BuzzFeed's attorneys do not want that server subpoenaed. They do not want it analyzed because it will not produce what they need to vindicate their client and convict Mr. Gubarev. These facts are clear. They're common sense. They're logic. Now, in Russia, a lot of people, wonder about the story of the dossier and how's it playing in Russia. Well, if you look at Sputnik or if you look at most of the major papers that you can get in English here in the United States, and you look at how the dossier is in Russia, it's a non-story, a non-issue. It's considered a joke. It's considered a hoax. It's considered a laughingstock. And there has not been one single credible Russian specialist in or out of government who has gone out to endorse the reports, the findings of the dossier, or anything that's claimed in the dossier. None of them, including any of the 4 Russian former or current officials, government officials, who are said to be the sources for the dossier. No one in Russia, nor here, of any credibility, any specialists have come out and said it. Even the CIA, even the FBI, they're only moderately confident. And they have not analyzed the server. Only CrowdStrike did that, and we know all about CrowdStrike. Now, half of this dossier, if you look at the dossier, about half the dossier is built on this fact that Trump's attorney, Michael Cohen, went to Prague and met with Russian officials and was working somehow to put together a collusion to win the election. And this would have involved hacking the DNC, releasing the emails to WikiLeaks, and the whole 9 yards. Of course, this has been disproven. Michael Cohen, in fact, did not even travel out of the country. It was alleged that this meeting occurred in August 2016. But we know from Michael Cohen's visa that he never traveled out of the country anywhere in the year 2016, let alone Prague. So, the first half of the dossier is completely false, proven unfalse. The other half deals with the P-Gate story, which we now know from Mr. Harding, Luke Harding, was given to him by a Clinton campaign official, is the one emailed Mr. Harding and gave him the P-Gate story. And that pretty much has been debunked. And all that leaves is some of these conversations from these shady Russian characters, some government officials, past and present, who talked about this kind of collusion. But not a single one of them have come forward to testify, to give any official statement, or volunteer to testify in any of these court hearings. Not a single bit have we heard from any of these people. Not a single one of these sources has come forward, nor do I know if they've even been asked to come forward. And of course we know that Christopher Steele's attorneys also tell us that he never met directly with any of these Russian sources, that it was all done through intermediaries. Now, I'm following this lawsuit. The one we've been watching is the one in the UK, because that's the one that's been moving forward. The issue in the UK lawsuit is they're trying to force Christopher Steele to testify, and he's fighting that. So that's in limbo. But now we're watching the case as it moves forward in Florida against BuzzFeed, and in that case, the judge has issued an order to depose Christopher Steele. And he will be asked about the payments, the sources of the dossier, who it was distributed to, what media organizations, and other questions such as that. So basically what the attorneys for Mr. Gubarev are saying in the BuzzFeed case in Florida, which is the same thing they'll be saying in the UK, is okay, if Christopher Steele is so confident that his dossier is true, then he shouldn't have any problem coming into court and testifying and telling us the whole story, giving us his sources and telling us everything. It's all public information now anyway. What's he got to hide? Of course, Christopher Steele is fighting tooth and nail to keep from being deposed or anything else in either of these lawsuits. He's in a stalemate now in the UK. That is kind of stuck. But here in the United States, in the judge in the Florida case against BuzzFeed has granted an order to depose Christopher Steele. Remember, in a civil lawsuit, you have two important things that occur before the case moves forward. You have the deposition, which is where both attorneys get to depose each other's client. You also have the discovery process, where both attorneys have to come to the table and present all the evidence that they have that they're going to use in their court case. This is why you see a lot of times in civil court cases, after the deposition and after the discovery process, a lot of times, most of the time, you will get an out-of-court settlement and the case will not move forward into a hearing. There'll be no judge or jury seated. There'll be an out-of-court settlement. A judge will stamp it, and they'll all agree to the terms that they came up with. But sometimes the case will move forward if they believe there's issues that need to be adjudicated. So this is where things stand in Florida. They are moving forward, and it appears that Mr. Steele will have to be deposed and will probably move forward into the discovery process. He's fighting it, but it looks like he's losing. He's somewhat winning in the UK, but he's losing in the Florida case. Now, it doesn't matter to me which of these cases move forward or not, as long as one of them does. Because as I've been saying, as we've been following this story, what's most important is to follow the civil cases, the one in the UK and the one in Florida, because they will move faster than the congressional committees. We will learn a lot more because it will come out in public information, and because it is public information, because it's a civil suit. We'll learn much more than we're going to learn from congressional committees who keep a lot of things behind closed doors, from the FBI, the Justice Department, the special prosecutor, because all that stuff is kept from us. It's kept in the dark, but not in these civil cases. So that's why I focus and watch the civil cases. We've gotten more information from the civil cases as they've been moving along, more than we've gotten from anything coming out of the Congress or anything else. So that is the status of the investigation right now. The bottom line, BuzzFeed and Christopher Steele have to prove, their allegations that the dossier is true. And at this point, it doesn't appear that they have been able to do that, nor are they willing to come forward, nor are the witnesses they're counting on able to come forward to prove their case. They are going to lose. Mr. Gubarev is going to win. And in the process, we're going to learn a lot more about the dossier. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back with a special broadcast for Sunday. You guys have a good night. Bye.